Dim torchlight flickers against the rough walls of a mountain cave, casting shadows over offerings left by hands long turned to dust. Clay vessels, worn smooth by centuries, stand in silent rows, each one a gift to powers unseen. This was no ordinary shrine, no forgotten outpost of some minor ancient cult. It was the living heart of a civilization that rose in the cradle of the Mediterranean, a people whose artistry, wealth, and power may have been the seed of the most enduring legend in history, Atlantis. They ruled the waves without armies, built palaces without walls, and lived as if peace itself was their greatest weapon. Yet the sea that had carried their fortunes would one day turn against them, and everything they had built would teeter on the edge of memory. They lived in peace, until the sea decided otherwise. What happens when the most advanced society of its age chooses peace over war? For the Minoans, the answer is written in both triumph and tragedy, a story that pulses through the veins of ancient myth. They stood at the crossroads of continents, their ships threading the web of trade that bound the Bronze Age world together. In their time, they were the envy of kings and the delight of merchants, yet they left no army of conquest, no empire carved in blood, only art, architecture, and mystery. Some say Plato's Atlantis was nothing more than a moral fable, a warning wrapped in allegory. Others believe his words were a dim recollection of a real place, a real people, who vanished in a storm of fire and waves. If we misread their story, if we let the truth slip beneath the surface of speculation, we risk losing them forever, leaving only the myth and the hollow echo of what was once the first great civilization of Europe. Crete lay cradled in the heart of the Mediterranean, a rugged island stretched like a bridge between three continents, its mountains and valleys shaping the fate of those who called it home. Fertile lowlands spilled between ridges, where olive trees clung to the slopes, and the coastline was carved with deep natural harbors, perfect for sheltering ships. From its shores the horizon pointed to Egypt to the south, Anatolia to the east, and the scattered Cycladic islands to the north. Geography had chosen Crete for greatness, though the people who first tilled its soil could hardly have imagined the scale of what would come. In these valleys, wheat and barley thrived, grapes hung heavy in the summer air, and olive groves swayed in the warm winds. The sea was not a barrier but a road, a glittering expanse that promised connection, wealth, and possibility. In the beginning, Crete was a land of small things, scattered Neolithic villages clinging to fertile ground and fresh water. Springs. The people lived in modest dwellings, raised goats and sheep, fished the surrounding waters, and shaped clay into simple pots. Life was slow, rhythmic, tied to the cycles of planting and harvest, but change was already stirring. Over centuries, pit houses gave way to stone-built homes, and simple pottery evolved into vessels adorned with spirals, lines, and geometric patterns that spoke of an emerging artistic spirit. At Knossos, people had lived continuously since 7000 BC, making it one of the oldest inhabited sites in Europe. The layers beneath its soil told a story of gradual growth, of a people learning to shape their environment with both skill and beauty. They built their settlements not on high, defensible ground but near fertile valleys and the open coast, a choice that would come to define their character. Unlike their mainland neighbors, they did not hide behind walls. They opened themselves to the sea, trusting it would bring opportunity rather than danger. Trade changed everything. At first, it was the obsidian, volcanic glass, sharper than any blade of stone, drawn from distant islands and carried across the waves. This dark, glittering material flowed into Cretan workshops, where it was shaped into tools that transformed daily life. But obsidian was only the beginning. Copper began arriving from Cyprus and Anatolia, unlocking a revolution in metallurgy. Local craftsmen learned to hammer, cast, and alloy metal, producing tools and weapons with strength and precision far beyond the Stone Age past. Gold and exotic stones appeared in the hands of elite families, proof of connections stretching far, beyond sight. Every new arrival from distant shores brought more than goods. It carried ideas, styles, and stories that would be absorbed into the island's growing identity. The transformation was not merely technological, it was social. Villages expanded into proto-urban hubs with streets, communal spaces, and specialized workshops. Potters, metalworkers, and textile weavers began to devote themselves fully to their crafts, no longer splitting their time between artistry and farming. The potter's wheel, learned from contacts in Egypt or Syria, revolutionized ceramic production, allowing thin, symmetrical vessels of breathtaking precision. Textile production reached extraordinary levels of refinement. The wool of Cretan sheep spun and woven into garments of color and complexity that would astonish visitors for centuries. These were not luxuries reserved for the elite. Even modest households held pottery of remarkable quality and tools that spoke of skilled hands. Cretan society was becoming something unique, open, prosperous, and outward-looking. Instead of fortified citadels, the island developed harbors that welcomed foreign ships. Instead of armies, it invested in fleets for trade. The mountain peaks became places of worship, where communities gathered to honor the gods under the open sky. Horns of consecration marking sacred spaces, bulls, roaming as symbols of strength and vitality. This openness fostered both innovation and confidence, as if the island itself believed it could flourish without fear. And perhaps for a time it was right, but every advantage carried a shadow. By tying its fortunes so tightly to the sea, Crete was also binding itself to forces beyond its control, shifting trade currents, the ambitions of neighbors, the moods of the water itself. The island's growing wealth and influence made it visible, tempting to those who looked upon it with envy. Still, in those early centuries, no threat seemed close enough to matter. Crete's people looked outward, expanding their networks, founding outposts on other islands, weaving themselves into the fabric of the Bronze Age world. They opened their shores to the world, believing the sea would always be a friend. In the warm sunlight of the Aegean, who could imagine that one day the same waters would carry not wealth, but ruin? By the dawn of the second millennium BC, Crete had entered its golden age, and its heart was built not in fortresses, but in palaces that seemed to breathe light. These were sprawling, multi-story complexes with open courtyards, grand staircases, and corridors that twisted like rivers through a landscape of stone. There were no enclosing walls, no looming battlements. Instead, the structures embraced the air, their rooms arranged to welcome sunlight and carry fresh breezes deep inside. Engineers mastered innovations that Europe would not see again for nearly 3,000 years. Light wells that poured daylight into interior chambers, plumbing systems that brought fresh water into private apartments, and drainage networks so precise they could still function today. Every detail reflected a society that built not for fear, but for beauty, comfort, and connection. From these palaces, the Minoans ruled an empire of the sea, though their power came not from conquest, but from attraction. Their fleets, sleek and fast, were the lifeblood of the Aegean, carrying wine, olive oil, finely crafted pottery, and textiles woven in colors that dazzled foreign markets. Ships returned laden with copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and gold from Egypt. Ports across the Mediterranean welcomed them, not as invaders, but as partners eager for trade with the people whose goods were unmatched in quality. The sea was their road, their shield, their empire, yet it was an empire of persuasion rather than force, built on mutual prosperity instead of fear of the sword. Within the palaces, life reflected this prosperity and the confidence it bred. Women held positions that would astonish much of the ancient world, not hidden away in private quarters, but leading ceremonies as priestesses, participating in athletic competitions, and appearing in art as figures of grace, authority, and power. Frescoes showed them draped in layered skirts and fitted bodices, their hair arranged in elaborate coils, presiding over rituals or standing alongside men as equals. Society seemed to move to a rhythm where beauty, skill, and ceremony were as important as wealth or status. The art celebrated harmony with the natural world, dolphins leaping across painted walls, lily blooming in vibrant pigments, octopuses curling across pottery, their tentacles almost alive. It was a vision of life where nature and humanity were not in conflict, but in conversation. Yet, even in this brilliance, there was a shadow. The Minoans had built their supremacy on a principle almost unthinkable to their neighbors: peace. While the great powers of the age fortified their cities, raised armies, and carved their names into history through war, Crete stood open to the world. This openness was their pride, but also their vulnerability. A society that relied on the goodwill of trade and the protection of the sea had no experience in meeting an enemy head-on. It is one thing to rule by attraction when the world is stable. It is another to keep power when the tide begins to turn. In the glittering courts of Knossos and Phaistos, it may not have seemed urgent. The storerooms were full, the fleets were busy, and the festivals drew crowds from distant lands. But history has a way of testing every gamble, and the Minoans had wagered everything on the belief that their world would remain as calm as the summer waters of the Aegean. The palaces of Crete were not just administrative centers or royal residences. To those who walked their halls for the first time, they were mazes of light and shadow, layered with meaning, beauty, and mystery. For foreign visitors, these complexes must have seemed alive, corridors winding endlessly, staircases rising and falling without clear order, rooms opening into unexpected courtyards. It is not difficult to imagine how the Greek storytellers, centuries later, turned these memories into the legend of the labyrinth. In their tales, the labyrinth was the prison of the Minotaur, a monstrous offspring of Queen Pasiphae, and a sacred bull fed with sacrificial victims from conquered Athens. It was Theseus, the hero, who killed the beast and escaped using a thread given to him by Ariadne, the king's daughter. But strip away the layers of myth, And what remains is something even more extraordinary, a real labyrinth, not of fantasy, but of stone crafted by human hands, where life and ritual intertwined in ways the later world could barely understand. When Sir Arthur Evans began his excavations at Knossos in 1900, he was struck by how closely the physical reality mirrored the legend's imagery. Here were the winding passageways, the elaborate throne room, the central courtyard where bulls once thundered in ceremonial games. Frescoes brought those moments to life, young men and women, their bodies painted in contrasting skin tones, vaulting over charging bulls in feats that seemed both impossible and yet strangely plausible. Archaeologists and biomechanical experts have since shown that the technique seizing the horns as the bull thrust upward, using the force to flip over its back, could be done, but only by athletes with extraordinary skill and fearlessness. For the Minoans, this was no mere spectacle. It was a sacred act, a dance with danger that embodied their view of life, that human strength and the forces of nature could be in harmony rather than opposition. The bull, in Minoan belief, was more than an animal. It was a symbol of power, fertility, and divine presence, an image carved into altars and painted into frescoes. Its horns echoed in the stone, horns of consecration that crowned sacred spaces. This reverence fed directly into the Greek imagination. To later cultures, the idea of such ceremonies, of touching the most dangerous of beasts and not killing it, but cooperating with it, must have seemed alien. To the Minoans, it was a declaration of values, that greatness came not from destruction, but from balance. In a Mediterranean world of constant warfare, that idea was revolutionary. The labyrinth itself may have been more than architectural complexity. It was a symbol, a representation of the journey between worlds, life and death, mortal and divine. In Minoan art, spirals and maze-like patterns appear again and again, perhaps as metaphors for spiritual passage or the cyclical nature of existence. When the Greeks inherited fragments of this imagery, they reworked it into a tale more in line with their own values: one hero, one monster, one victory. Yet the truth was far subtler. The monster in the labyrinth was never meant to be slain. It was to be faced, understood, and survived. Women, as in every other aspect of Minoan life, stood at the center of these sacred dramas. Priestesses presided over ceremonies in open-air sanctuaries and within dimly lit shrines deep inside the palaces. Their images dominate the surviving art: bare-breasted figures in layered skirts, arms raised in gestures of blessing or invocation, flanked by animals, flowers, or sacred objects. The famed snake goddess figurines with serpents winding through their hands may have represented a deity, a priestess, or the union of the two roles. Snakes, like bulls, held potent symbolic weight, guardians of the underworld, symbols of renewal and transformation, living connections between the earth and the divine. The prominence of female figures in art and ritual has led some to suggest that Minoan society was matriarchal, or at least far more egalitarian than its contemporaries. While it is impossible to know the exact political structure, the absence of male warrior iconography and the abundance of female ceremonial depictions is striking. In later Greek myth, goddesses like Ariadne and Pasiphae are given central roles, a possible echo of this earlier cultural reality. But the myths also warp their stories, casting them as tragic lovers or dangerous ascetic tresses, reshaping the Minoan image into something more palatable to a patriarchal age. Power in Minoan Crete seems to have been tied to the sacred as much as to the political. There are no clear records of individual kings like those of Egypt or Mesopotamia, no monumental tombs to glorify a single ruler. Instead, the palaces themselves were the symbols of authority, places where administration, ritual, and culture blended seamlessly. The throne room at Knossos, with its alabaster seat and painted griffins, may have been used not by a secular monarch, but by a priest-king or priestess-queen whose legitimacy came from the gods. This blending of roles made leadership a matter of both governance and spiritual stewardship, and it may explain why the Greeks later remembered King Minos as both a ruler and a judge in the afterlife. The Minoan religious landscape extended beyond. The palaces, mountaintop sanctuaries, served as communal worship sites, visible for miles, binding together the lowland settlements with a shared spiritual geography. Sacred caves, often associated with fertility or underworld deities, were filled with offerings, bronze figurines, ceramic vessels, jewelry, left by pilgrims over centuries. These sites connected the people not only to the divine, but to the land itself, reinforcing a cultural identity rooted in the rhythms of nature. To outsiders, this web of sacred places might have seemed like the infrastructure of a mystery religion, each site holding its own part of an interconnected ritual whole. The myths we know of the Minotaur, of Ariadne, of Daedalus the labyrinth builder, are the shadows of these truths, refracted through centuries of retelling. Daedalus, the master craftsman, may have been a memory of the Minoan architects whose skills seemed miraculous to later generations. Ariadne, the woman who aids the hero with her thread, could be the remnant of a goddess or priestess who guided initiates through the maze of life and death. Even the Minotaur itself, half man, half bull, might be a distorted reflection of the bull-leaping athletes, whose union with the animal in ritual formed a momentary, living hybrid of human and beast. Why did the Greeks remember this culture at all when so many others vanished without a trace? Perhaps because the Minoans' approach to power was so unusual that it demanded explanation. A people who ruled the seas without armies, who built palaces without walls, and who worshipped not the storm of war but the cycles of nature. Such a society was almost incomprehensible to the warrior states that followed, turning them into. Myth was a way of making sense of something that did not fit the usual mold, and in the retelling, the Greeks reshaped the story to reflect their own values. The labyrinth became a trap, the bull a monster, the hero a slayer. Yet beneath the mythic overlay, the archaeological record still hums with the Minoan's true voice. In the intricate seal stones, the marine-themed frescoes, the ceremonial double axes, and the carefully aligned courtyards, there is a consistent vision, one of order, beauty, and integration with the world around them. It is a vision that survives not just in artifacts, but in the way those artifacts continue to provoke wonder. The labyrinth as a concept has endured for thousands of years because it speaks to something deeper, the human sense that life itself is a winding path, full of turns we cannot predict, leading us toward encounters that may change us forever. But there is a darker thread woven through this memory. For all their openness and cultural sophistication, the Minoans left themselves exposed. Their lack of fortifications, their reliance on naval control through commerce, their focus on ceremonial rather than military preparedness. These choices, while visionary, were also a gamble. When the world was stable, it made them rich and admired. When the world changed, those same choices would leave them vulnerable. Even the myths in their altered form seem to acknowledge this. The Minotaur is slain. Ariadne is abandoned. The labyrinth becomes a prison, not a path of initiation. The transformation of these symbols may reflect the historical reality that the Minoans' way of life was not defeated in a single battle, but gradually overwhelmed by forces they could not counter. In the end, the mythic memory of Crete is not a single story, but a palimpsest, layer upon layer of interpretation, invention, and survival. The archaeological labyrinth is overlaid with the literary one. The sacred bull becomes the monstrous minotaur. The priestess becomes the tragic lover. Yet through these changes, something essential remains visible. The impression of a people who imagined power differently, who believed that beauty and balance could be the foundation of greatness. It is this that makes their memory so persistent and so haunting. If we listen carefully, past the hero's triumph and the monster's roar, past the thread unwinding in the darkness, we can hear the original voice. It tells of a civilization that turned its architecture into a metaphor for life, that wove its rituals into the very structure of its cities, that saw no need to wall itself off from the world. It whispers of a time when harmony, not conquest, was the measure of power, a time when the labyrinth led not to a beast, but to understanding. And perhaps that is why the legend still lives, not as a relic of a forgotten age, but as a reminder of what was, of what could have been, and of what might still be possible if we dare to imagine power without fear. In the heart of the Bronze Age, when the palaces of Crete stood at the height of their beauty, the sea that had been their greatest ally began to stir with forces beyond comprehension. The disaster that would follow was born far from the island itself, in the volcanic caldera of Thera, the modern island of Santorini, a place where fire and water had long been locked in a dangerous embrace. To the Minoans, Thera was more than a distant outpost. Its harbor bustled with trade, its streets lined with homes painted in colors that echoed the deep blue of the Aegean and the red of volcanic cliffs. Frescoes in the buried city of Akrotiri would later reveal a society that mirrored the elegance and refinement of Crete itself. But beneath this beauty, pressure was building, quite literally, deep within the earth. Thera's volcano had erupted before, but never in living memory with the scale that was coming. At first there were tremors, small enough to ignore, though they rattled storage jars and sent dust drifting from the rafters of Akrotiri's homes. Then the ground began to heave, and cracks split the walls of buildings. For days, perhaps weeks, the island must have lived in fear, the air growing heavy with the smell of sulfur. When the eruption began in earnest, it would have been like the sky itself had opened in rage. Columns of ash and pumice roared upward, blotting out the sun, turning day into a choking night. Lightning flickered within the rising clouds, a storm, born of fire and stone. The first phase was violent, but not yet apocalyptic, an explosive venting of pressure that hurled ash and pumice across the sea. Ships in the Aegean would have found themselves suddenly navigating through falling debris, the waves whipped into chaos. Then came the second phase, the collapse. The magma chamber beneath Thera emptied so swiftly that the volcano's central cone fell in on itself, sending millions of tons of rock plunging into the sea. This collapse unleashed one of the largest tsunamis in recorded history. Waves taller than the masts of the tallest ships radiated outward, striking the coasts of nearby islands in minutes and reaching Crete's northern shores in less than an hour. For the Minoans, the devastation must have been almost incomprehensible. The great harbor cities, Knossos, Malea, and others would have been hit with walls of water that tore ships from their moorings and smashed them against the shore. Warehouses filled with goods for export were ripped apart, their contents swept out to sea. Entire fleets may have been destroyed in a single day. The palaces themselves, set back from the immediate coast, likely survived the direct impact, but their lifelines, the ships, the ports, the trade routes, were shattered, and the disaster did not end there. In the weeks and months that followed, the ash cloud from Thera's eruption spread across the eastern Mediterranean, darkening skies and altering weather patterns. Crops failed as sunlight weakened, and the air grew cooler. Fine volcanic ash settled over fields, choking plants and poisoning the soil. The sea, once the source of wealth, became unpredictable. Fishing grounds were disrupted and currents shifted. The Minoan world, so finely tuned to the rhythms of trade and agriculture, found itself struggling against forces it could not control. Some have suggested that Thera's eruption directly destroyed the Minoan civilization, but the truth is more complicated and more tragic. The palaces of Crete still stood, and the people still lived, but their confidence had been shaken. The very basis of their prosperity, their mastery of the sea, was now in question. Without their fleets and their trade routes fully intact, the delicate balance of power in the Aegean began to shift. Rivals who had once respected Minoan supremacy saw weakness. Among them were the Mycenaeans, warrior kings from the Greek mainland, who had long admired Minoan culture but were not bound by its ideals of peace, yet, for all its destruction. The eruption left behind something else, a shadow on memory that may have fed the legend of Atlantis. Plato's description, written over 1,000 years later, speaks of a great maritime power destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophe, swallowed by the sea after earthquakes and floods. The parallels are haunting. Thera's eruption was one of the most violent in human history, and its impact would have been felt across the known world. News of it passed from sailor to sailor, storyteller to storyteller, could easily have taken on mythic proportions. By the time it reached Plato's pen, it was a tale shaped by centuries of retelling, layered with moral lessons and philosophical intent, yet still echoing with the truth of what had happened in the Aegean for the people of Crete. The catastrophe was not an ending, but the beginning of a long, slow unraveling. The damage to their fleets could be repaired, but the trust in their invincibility could not. The palaces still held festivals, still welcomed traders, but the number of foreign ships in their harbors began to change. The Mycenaeans, sensing opportunity, expanded their influence over the islands and into the wider trade networks. Crete, once the center of the web, found itself becoming just another strand. The psychological impact of the disaster must also have been immense. The Minoans' religious life was deeply tied to the forces of nature, to the cycles of fertility and renewal, the balance between land and sea. The eruption shattered that balance in a way no ritual could repair. What did it mean when the sea, once their protector, turned into a destroyer? When the mountains they revered as sacred trembled and spat ash into the sky? Some shrines may have been abandoned, others perhaps filled with offerings made in desperation rather than celebration. In the centuries that followed, memory of the event may have shifted from lived experience to cultural warning, a reminder that even the most prosperous society is vulnerable to the whims of nature. The myth of Atlantis, if it indeed carries the echo of Thera, serves this function perfectly. The pride of a great civilization, its sudden destruction, and the moral that no human power can stand forever against the elements. For the Minoans, however, it was not pride that doomed them, but geography. They had built their lives in the embrace of a sea that could give as generously as it could take away. The fire in the sea, as we might call it now, was more than a natural disaster. It was a turning point in the history of the Mediterranean, shifting the balance of power, reshaping economies, and altering the course of civilizations. For the Minoans, it marked the moment when their future was no longer theirs to control. The palaces remained for another century, perhaps more, but the foundations had cracked, not in stone, but in the confidence of a people who had believed the sea would always be their friend. In the end, it was that loss of certainty, as much as the physical destruction, that set the stage for the final act of their story. In the years after the eruption of Thera, Crete's harbors no longer thrummed with the same easy confidence. The Minoans rebuilt what they could, repairing ports, mending ships, restoring trade routes, but the rhythm had changed. The great palaces still stood, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, their storerooms once again filled with amphorae of wine and oil, their courts alive with festivals and rituals. Yet beneath the surface, the balance of power in the Aegean had shifted. The Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland, long trading partners and cultural admirers of the Minoans, began to see themselves not as students, but as heirs in waiting. The Mycenaeans were a different breed. Their world was built on the prestige of war, the glory of the warrior king, the fortification of high citadels. They were no strangers to the sea, but they viewed it as a highway for expansion and conquest, not merely for trade. Their palaces at Mycenae, Tyrans, and Pylos were ringed with massive walls, each stone a declaration of their readiness for siege. They had looked to Crete as a model for art, administration, and religion, but now they also saw an island, weakened, its fleets diminished, its influence waning. In the eyes of the Mycenaean elite, it was not just an opportunity, it was a responsibility, almost a right, to step in and claim what they saw as their inheritance. How exactly the Mycenaeans took control of Crete is still debated by historians. Some imagine a sudden invasion, warships cutting across the Aegean, troops spilling onto Cretan shores, the palaces seized in swift and decisive campaigns. Others suggest a more gradual infiltration, Mycenaean merchants settling in the ports, marrying into Minoan aristocracy, gaining influence until the transition of power was all but inevitable. Archaeology offers clues. The art in the palaces begins to shift, showing warriors with spears and chariots alongside the dolphins in Linear B. The Mycenaean script replaces the undeciphered Linear A in administrative records. And certain, Religious symbols are subtly reinterpreted to fit Mycenaean beliefs. Whether by conquest or by quiet takeover, the result was the same. Crete's identity began to change. The most visible transformation was in art and architecture. Minoan frescoes had celebrated the natural world, leaping dolphins, blooming flowers, ritual processions. The Mycenaeans did not erase these, but they added their own imagery, scenes of battle, hunting, and military display. Armor and weaponry, once absent from Cretan walls, now appeared in storerooms and burial goods. The palaces, though still grand, became less open, their designs shifting subtly toward security and control. The airy, labyrinthine courtyards that had once flowed with light and breeze were given heavier doors, narrower passages, and a sense of inward focus. Religion, too, adapted. The great goddess figures of Minoan worship, the mistress of animals, the snake goddess, the mountain mother, remained, but their prominence dimmed as the Mycenaeans brought in their own pantheon of warrior gods. Zeus and Poseidon began to take roles alongside or even above the older deities. Bulls were still sacred, but their role in ritual diminished. Chariots, symbols of Mycenaean aristocracy, appeared in ceremonial contexts. This blending of belief systems created something new, not purely Minoan, not purely Mycenaean, but a hybrid that would, in time, feed directly into the religion of classical Greece. For the ordinary people of Crete, the changes may have felt subtle at first. Markets still bustled, ships still came and went, the festivals still lit the nights with music and fire. Yet over time, the differences would have been impossible to ignore. Taxes were collected under new rules, perhaps more rigid than before. Local leaders reported not only to Knossos, but to mainland overseers. Young men might have found themselves conscripted into military service, a concept alien to their fathers. The ideal of power through peaceful trade gave way to the prestige of arms. The greatest irony was that the Mycenaeans valued Minoan culture so highly that they preserved much of it, but in doing so, they also transformed it beyond recognition. The grace and openness of the Minoan Golden Age became a memory, even as its symbols remained carved into stone. The bull-leaping games may have continued for a time, but under a different ethos, perhaps more as a spectacle for elites than a deeply spiritual act. The labyrinth persisted as a palace structure, but its meaning shifted toward control and centralization rather than the mystical journey it once embodied. The decline of Minoan Crete under Mycenaean dominance was not an immediate collapse. In fact, the island remained prosperous for a time, its ports still vital to trade routes linking the Aegean with Egypt and the Near East. But the cultural shift was profound and in some ways irreversible. A society built on balance with nature, on the artistry of peace, had been reoriented toward the priorities of a warrior aristocracy. The sea, once the gentle road of commerce, was now also a corridor for military campaigns. And in this new reality, the qualities that had once made the Minoans unique were no longer valued in the same way. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the late 14th century BC, Knossos itself became the seat of Mycenaean administration. Its records written in Linear B for perhaps a generation or two, this fusion state thrived, blending the administrative skill and maritime knowledge of the Minoans with the military power and political ambition of the Mycenaeans. But this was not the same civilization that had flourished in the centuries before Thera's eruption. It was a successor state, wearing the garments of the old world while marching to the drum of the new. And then, as so often happens in the ancient world, the new order itself began to crumble. By the 12th century BC, the Mycenaean palatial system across the Aegean collapsed in the wider upheaval historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Trade routes faltered, cities were abandoned, literacy vanished for centuries. On Crete, the last echoes of Minoan culture faded into the quiet of the so-called Greek Dark Ages. The palaces fell into ruin, their frescoes crumbling, their storerooms empty. The labyrinth was no longer a living structure of administration and ritual. It was a memory, a ruin, a story to be told and retold until it became legend. For the Minoans, the day the sea stopped protecting them was not a single moment, but a process, a slow withdrawal of the tide that had carried them to greatness. First came the natural disaster that crippled their fleets. Then came the neighbors who admired them enough to take their place. And finally came the long shadow of history, in which their identity was subsumed into the cultures that followed. In the end, they were not erased. Their influence lived on in Greek religion, art, and myth. But the society that had once believed peace was power, that had built its palaces without walls, was gone. And yet, even in their decline, the Minoans left something that outlived their conquerors. The myths of the labyrinth, the Minotaur, Ariadne's thread, carried their memory forward in ways they could never have imagined. The Mycenaeans themselves would vanish into the collapse, but the stories rooted in Minoan Crete would endure, reshaped and retold until they became part of the cultural DNA of the West. In this way, the Minoans did live twice, once in the sunlight of their own age, and once in the twilight of legend. The story of Atlantis is one of the most famous in all of human history, an island empire of great wealth and beauty, a people blessed with unmatched power, undone in a single night of disaster. For over 2 millennia, it has captured imaginations, fueling expeditions, debates, and countless retellings. Yet, in all of these centuries, no candidate for Atlantis has been as compelling or as haunting as the Minoan civilization of Crete and the eruption of Thera. Plato, the source of the Atlantis story, wrote in the 4th century BC, centuries after the fall of the Minoans. He claimed the tale came from Solon, an Athenian lawgiver who had learned it from Egyptian priests, who in turn had preserved it from an even older time. According to Plato, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean. Yet its influence reached into the Mediterranean. It was a great naval power, rich in resources, with concentric rings of land and water at its capital. The Atlanteans, at first virtuous, grew arrogant and corrupt, and the gods punished them with earthquakes and floods, submerging their island beneath the sea. At first glance, much of this sounds like pure allegory, Plato's way of illustrating philosophical points about the dangers of hubris and the ideal state. But certain details, stripped of their moral framing, ring strangely familiar to anyone who knows the story of the Minoans. Here was a maritime empire, a people who ruled at sea not by conquest but by influence, whose wealth was drawn from trade, and whose culture shone across the known world. Here was a society undone, not by foreign invasion, at least initially, but by catastrophe, a disaster involving earthquakes, floods, and the sea turning against them. The eruption of Thera, around 1600 BC, fits the kind of destruction Plato describes with unnerving precision. The tsunami waves generated by the caldera collapse would have devastated Minoan ports, and the ash cloud would have disrupted agriculture for years. Earthquakes common in the region could have compounded the destruction, shaking the very foundations of their palaces. It is not hard to imagine that, to anyone witnessing these events, it might seem as if the island was cursed, punished by forces beyond human control. Over centuries of oral retelling, such an account could easily merge with local myths and foreign embellishments until it emerged in Plato's hands as the fully formed Atlantis legend. There are even tantalizing architectural echoes. Plato describes Atlantis' capital as having concentric rings of land and water, a layout that to modern readers might seem far-fetched, but to someone familiar with the circular caldera of Thera, surrounded by sea, it would have been instantly recognizable. The port city of Akrotiri, buried under volcanic ash, contained advanced architecture, vibrant frescoes, and sophisticated water systems, all qualities Plato ascribes to Atlantis. Though the exact geography does not match perfectly, the imagery overlaps enough to suggest that the storytellers who preserved the tale may have been remembering real places, altered and idealized in the telling. Still, the Minoan hypothesis is not without its critics. Some point out that Plato places Atlantis far beyond the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic Ocean itself. Others note that he dates its destruction to 9,000 years before his own time. Far earlier than the Bronze Age, supporters of the Minoan link argue that these details may be distortions, the result of mistranslation or symbolic exaggeration. Ancient numbers were notoriously fluid, and beyond the Pillars of Heracles could mean beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, but in some contexts, it might simply mean far to the west. The story's journey from the Aegean to Egypt, too. Athens over centuries would have given it plenty of opportunities to shift. The question then becomes, was Atlantis ever meant to be taken as history at all? Plato himself presents it in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, works concerned with philosophy, morality, and the nature of the ideal society. To many scholars, the story was a vehicle for these ideas, not a historical account. Yet, even if Atlantis was intended as allegory, Plato could still have based its details on older, real events that had been preserved in memory precisely because they were so dramatic and destructive. The Minoan civilization, with its grandeur and sudden blow from nature, fits this role almost too well. For modern historians, the Atlantis-Minoan connection is not a matter of proving that Crete was Atlantis, but of recognizing that myths often preserve kernels of truth. Oral traditions can stretch events beyond recognition, but they rarely invent entire narratives without some seed of reality. The Minoans' command of the sea, their sudden vulnerability after Thera, and their eventual disappearance as an independent culture form a narrative spine onto which centuries of myth could easily attach flesh. The parallels, the maritime power, the wealth, the advanced architecture, the cataclysm are simply too striking to ignore. But there is another layer, a darker one, to this hypothesis. If the Minoans are indeed the root of the Atlantis myth, then their legacy has been reframed in a way they could never have controlled. In Plato's version, the Atlanteans fall because they become corrupt, decadent, and morally weak. There is no hint of this in the archaeological record of Crete. Their downfall appears to have been driven by natural disaster and shifting geopolitical tides, not moral collapse. Yet this recasting of their fate has endured for more than 2,000 years, overshadowing the real resilience they showed in the face of disaster. In a sense, they were not just victims of volcanic fire and tidal waves. They were victims of the storytelling process itself. For those who support the Minoan-Atlantis link, the work is as much about restoring dignity as it is about solving a historical puzzle. By identifying the Minoans and the myth, they aim to give credit to a civilization that shaped the Bronze Age world and whose innovations in art, architecture, and maritime trade rippled outward long after their political power waned. They also challenged a simplistic moral that Plato's version attaches, replacing it with a more nuanced understanding of how fragile even the most advanced societies can be in the face of environmental catastrophe. The debate continues, with new discoveries feeding both sides. Advances in volcanology have given more precise dates for the Thera eruption, narrowing the gap between it and the height of Minoan power. Underwater surveys have located tsunami deposits on Crete, supporting the idea that the island suffered massive coastal destruction. At Akrotiri, ongoing excavations reveal a city frozen in time, offering glimpses of a culture as sophisticated as any in the ancient world. Each new find adds texture to the picture and to the possibility that the Minoans' true story lies at the heart of one of humanity's greatest legends. Yet perhaps the most compelling reason to connect Atlantis to the Minoans is the way the two stories feel the same. Both are about a people who lived in balance with the sea, who harnessed it for wealth and power without the constant drumbeat of war, who believed in their own stability until a force from nature shattered it all. Both are about the fragility of human achievement in the face of the Earth's deep, indifferent power. And both ultimately are about memory, how we keep it, how we lose it, and how we reshape it to fit the needs of the present. Whether or not Plato's Atlantis was Minoan Crete may never be settled to everyone's satisfaction, but the connection forces us to look at the Minoans not as a remote curiosity, but as a civilization that has lived twice, once in the palaces and harbors of the Bronze Age, and once in the enduring myth that has outlived every stone they laid. The fog that surrounds Atlantis is thick, but within it, the silhouette of Crete looms large. Not a perfect match, but close enough to make the heart quicken. If the truth is in there, it is worth finding, not just to solve an ancient riddle, but to give the Minoans their due as one of the great powers of human history, whose light was dimmed not by hubris, but by the fire and water of the world they had trusted too much. For more than 2 millennia after their decline, the Minoans lay buried in the soil of Crete, their cities and palaces reduced to faint outlines, their art hidden under layers of earth, their name forgotten. The Greeks remembered fragments of their story through myth, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, Ariadne's thread, but they no longer knew that these were the echoes of a real civilization. Even the Romans, who left their mark on nearly every corner of the Mediterranean, treated Crete as just another provincial possession, with no sense of the brilliance that had once radiated from its shores. For centuries after, the island was passed from empire to empire, Byzantine, Arab, Venetian, Ottoman, each leaving its own traces, but none suspecting that beneath the olive groves and the stone villages lay one of the most advanced societies of the ancient world. By the late 19th century, archaeology had begun to awaken Europe to the deep history of the Mediterranean. Schliemann had already uncovered Troy and Mycenaean, proving that Homer's epics had some basis in fact. In Crete, whispers of something older, something stranger, began to circulate among scholars and adventurers. Local farmers sometimes dug up clay tablets with strange symbols, unlike any Greek script, or fragments of pottery painted in unfamiliar styles. There were runes, too, in places like Knossos and Phaistos, jumbled stone walls and mounds that looked too deliberate to be natural. Yet no one had yet pieced them together into a coherent picture. The man who would change that was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist with an unshakable belief in the power of ancient stories. In 1900, Evans began excavating at Knossos, on a hill known as Kefala, where earlier travelers had reported finding ancient remains. Within weeks, he realized he had stumbled onto something extraordinary, the sprawling foundations of a palace. Unlike anything in Greece, as the earth gave way, Evans uncovered complex corridors, grand staircases, storerooms lined with massive clay pithoi, and frescoes still vivid with color despite their age. It was a structure so vast and intricate that it seemed to match, in spirit if not in exact form, the mythical labyrinth. Evans was not content simply to excavate. He wanted to restore. As the ruins emerged, he began reconstructing parts of the palace using concrete, guided by his own interpretations of how the original must have looked. To his critics, this was a dangerous mixing of archaeology and imagination, but to Evans it was a way of bringing the past back to life. He called the civilization he had uncovered Minoan, after the legendary king Minos, linking it directly to the myths that had first hinted at its existence. In doing so, he gave the nameless people of Bronze Age Crete an identity, one that, for better or worse, would forever be tied to their mythological shadow. The finds at Knossos astonished the world. The frescoes were unlike anything from Greece or Egypt. Dolphins leaping through blue water, lily blooming in brilliant reds, women with flounced skirts and bared chests, athletes vaulting over bulls. There were no scenes of battle, no processions of armed kings. Instead, the art celebrated nature, ceremony, and a kind of fluid grace. The architecture, too, was unlike the fortified citadels of the Mycenaeans, open, airy, oriented toward courtyards and light. Evans' team uncovered complex plumbing systems, including flushable toilets, that would not be matched in Europe. For centuries, everywhere they dug, they found evidence of a society more focused on beauty, ritual, and commerce than on war. Yet the most tantalizing discoveries were the inscribed clay tablets. Evans quickly realized that they contained two distinct scripts. One, which he called Linear A, remained undeciphered. The other, Linear B, would eventually be shown to be an early form of Greek. To Evans, this suggested a fascinating progression. The Minoans had developed their own writing system, used for administration and perhaps religious purposes, and the later Mycenaeans had adapted it for their own language after taking control of Crete. The survival of these tablets, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces, provided the first direct documentary link between the world of the Minoans and the emerging Greek world that followed. Evan's vision of the Minoans was deeply romantic. He painted them as a peaceful matriarchal society, ruled by priestesses and devoted to art, nature, and the sea. In his telling, they were a utopia undone by natural disaster and foreign conquest. A vision that resonated with early 20th century audiences weary of industrialized war. But this idealized picture was shaped as much by Evan's own Edwardian sensibilities as by the evidence. Later excavations and analyses have complicated it, revealing signs of hierarchy, elite control of resources, and even human sacrifice in rare ritual contexts. The Minoans, it seems, were no more immune to the complexities and contradictions of civilization than any other people. Still, Evan's work at Knossos and the subsequent excavations at other sites like Phaistos, Mallia, and Zakros reintroduced the Minoans to the modern world. In the decades that followed, Crete became a touchstone for debates about the origins of European civilization. Were the Minoans a uniquely European creation, or were they shaped by influences from Egypt and the Near East? Were they truly peaceful, or did their control of the sea rest on unacknowledged displays of force? And how much of their apparent prosperity was the result of a centralized, perhaps even coercive, palace economy? The rediscovery of the Minoans also fed directly into the Atlantis debate. The spectacle of Knossos, with its advanced engineering and sudden destruction, seemed to many a perfect match for Plato's story. Popular writers, seizing on the romance of the idea, cast the Minoans as a real-life Atlantis, their brilliance lost to the waves after the Thera eruption. Archaeologists were more cautious, but even the most skeptical could not deny that the parallels maritime power, sudden disaster, cultural memory were striking. For Crete itself, the excavation of its ancient past became both a point of pride and a tourist magnet. The restored sections of Knossos, with their brightly painted reconstructions, drew visitors from around the world, eager to walk the halls of the labyrinth. In doing so, they were participating in a tradition as old as the myths themselves, blending history and story, archaeology and imagination until the lines blurred. The Minoans had once lived in the realm of legend. Now they lived in the realm of modern heritage, their image shaped as much by the needs of the present as by the realities of the past. Yet for all the color and glamour of their rediscovery, there is an undeniable melancholy in the ruins. The frescoes, however vivid, are fragments. The palaces, however grand in footprint, are roofless, their walls broken by time. The scripts, however intriguing, are still partially mute, linear, a stubbornly defying decipherment, keeping the Minoans' own words from us. We can reconstruct their architecture, admire their art, trace their trade routes, but we cannot yet hear their voices as they understood themselves. In that silence lies the true fog between history and myth, the space where Atlantis still hides. If Arthur Evans gave the Minoans their name and first modern identity, the century that followed has been an ongoing act of reinterpretation and sometimes reinvention. Every new generation of archaeologists has brought fresh tools, theories, and perspectives to Crete, peeling back layers of Evans' vision while adding their own. And in this constant reshaping, the Minoans have become more than just an ancient people. They have become a mirror, reflecting the hopes, fears, and values of those who study them. In the mid-20th century, after the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Minoans' image as a peaceful, art-loving society gained renewed appeal. In an era searching for alternatives to militarism, the idea of a Bronze Age civilization flourishing without constant warfare became a kind of cultural touchstone. Popular histories, travel writing, and even political speeches used the Minoans as a symbol of what a harmonious, cooperative society might look like. The bright, almost whimsical dolphin fresco from Knossos appeared in magazines and tourist brochures, standing in for the idea of the first Europeans, civilized, graceful, and free from the brutalities of the ancient world. But in the 1960s and 70s, archaeology began to push back against this idyllic portrait. New excavations at sites beyond Knossos revealed fortifications in some coastal settlements, and hints of weapons manufacture appeared in the archaeological record. A handful of burials contained daggers and other martial gear, and in the shadows of Minoan ritual, darker possibilities emerged. At the site of Animaspilia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of what may have been a human sacrifice. A young man laid on a platform, with a bronze blade nearby, and evidence that the ritual had been interrupted by an earthquake. Whether this was a singular event or part of a broader religious practice remains debated, but it served as a reminder that even the most advanced civilizations can have edges we find unsettling. The reinterpretations did not diminish the Minoans' achievements. Their architecture, art, and maritime skills still stand among the greatest of the ancient world, but they stripped away the idea that they were somehow outside the normal spectrum of human complexity. They were neither utopia nor dystopia, but something more real, a society balancing ambition, ritual, and adaptation in a volatile environment. And perhaps this makes their story even more valuable, because it is not a fantasy. It is a lesson in both the possibilities and vulnerabilities of civilization. In the realm of cultural legacy, the Minoans have proven extraordinarily fertile ground. Artists and writers have drawn from their imagery for over a century, weaving Minoan motifs into everything from surrealist paintings to fantasy novels. The bull leaper has become an icon in itself, appearing on Olympic posters, modern jewelry, and even corporate logos. Designers have borrowed the vibrant color palettes and flowing lines of Minoan frescoes to create fashion collections and stage designs. In each adaptation, the Minoans are reimagined to suit the aesthetic of the moment, their reality blending ever further with creative interpretation. Politically, the Minoans have been invoked in multiple, sometimes contradictory, ways. In the early 20th century, Evans and others framed them as the first Europeans, emphasizing their links to the cultural heritage of the West. In the post-colonial era, some scholars have highlighted their connections to Egypt and the Near East, positioning them as part of a wider, interconnected Afro-Eurasian world. In Crete itself, the Minoans have become a symbol of local pride, a reminder that the island was once the center of a maritime empire. Tourist campaigns celebrate them as the root of Cretan identity, even as academic debates continue about just how directly modern Crete can claim descent from its Bronze Age inhabitants. In the digital age, the Minoans have found new life in ways Evans could never have imagined. 3D reconstructions of Knossos and other sites allow visitors to walk through the palaces online, exploring spaces that no longer exist in the physical world. Archaeological data sets are shared globally, allowing specialists from many disciplines to reanalyze old finds and question long-held assumptions. Amateur historians and content creators produce documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube series about Minoan art, religion, and the Atlantis connection, reaching audiences far beyond the academic sphere. The Minoans, once silent beneath the earth, now have a louder cultural voice than they have had in 3,000 years. Yet the core mystery remains. For all the data, for all the reconstructions, the Minoans' own voice, their thoughts, their myths, in their own words, is still largely inaccessible. Linear A remains undeciphered, resisting every attempt to crack it. Until it is read, we will not know the names of their gods as they spoke them, the poetry of their ceremonies, or the precise words of their laws. In that silence lies both frustration and a lure. The Minoans keep their secrets, not because they wish to, they are long gone, but because time itself has erased the keys we need. This gap ensures that their image will always be, at least partly, a work of imagination. For modern Crete, the legacy is tangible. The island's museums house some of the most beautiful and evocative artifacts in the world. The Phaistos disc, with its mysterious spiral of symbols, the snake goddess figurines, the intricately carved seal stones depicting everything from religious rites to marine life. Tourists walk the same sunlit courtyards where Minoan dignitaries once gathered, stand before the same mountain vistas, and hear the same wind that swept through the island in the Bronze Age. In these moments, the gap between past and present narrows, and the Minoans feel less like a vanished people and more like distant neighbors, separated not by a gulf of identity, but by the accident of time. Ultimately, the rediscovery of the Minoans is a reminder that civilizations can live twice, first in their own age, and again in the age that rediscovers them. The first life is physical, measured in ships and palaces and harvests. The second is cultural, measured in stories, images, and the meanings we attach to them. The Minoan's second life is still unfolding, shaped by each new excavation, each new interpretation, each new way the world chooses to remember them. They remain as they have been since Evan's spade first struck the stones of Knossos, a civilization half in history and half in myth, a people who have left us walls and frescoes, yes, but also a labyrinth in the mind, winding always toward. The next question. Standing in the courtyard of Knossos today, surrounded by broken columns and sun-bleached stones, it's tempting to think of the Minoans as an echo, something so far removed from us that their fate has nothing to do with our own. But that's a comforting illusion. The truth is that their story is as much about the present as it is about the past. The Minoans were not primitive. They were not fumbling toward civilization. They had already built one. They commanded trade, networks stretching across continents, engineered buildings so advanced that their principles are still admired, and developed a culture that celebrated beauty and ritual. And yet they fell. If we strip away the romantic haze, we're left with the unsettling question: if it happened to them, what makes us think it can't happen to us? The first lesson the Minoans offer is about fragility in the face of nature. Crete's wealth and influence were tied to the sea. It was their lifeline, their shield, their stage. But the same sea that carried their ships could also rise against them. The eruption of Thera was not something they could have prevented, predicted, or even fully understood, yet it reshaped their entire world. In a matter of hours, it wiped out fleets, drowned harbors, and sent shockwaves through their economy. The Minoans had no plan for such an event because they could not imagine it. This is the trap of prosperity. The longer a system works, the more its inhabitants believe it always will. We are no different. Our global systems, trade, communications, climate stability feel permanent because they work now, but all of them rest on natural and human-made conditions that can change in a heartbeat. The second lesson is about over-reliance on a single advantage. For the Minoans, it was their maritime supremacy and the cultural capital they derived from it. They had no need for walls because they believed their fleets and their diplomacy would protect them. This worked brilliantly in times of stability, but left them exposed when the balance shifted. Once the Mycenaeans or any aggressive rival sensed weakness, the Minoans had little in the way of military infrastructure to deter them. In our own time, societies and even individuals often rest heavily on a single advantage, a dominant technology, a unique resource, a favorable geopolitical position, without fully considering what happens if it's lost. The Minoan story shows how quickly dominance can turn to dependency, and dependency to vulnerability. There is also a lesson about the double-edged sword of openness. The Minoans thrived because they welcomed the outside world. They imported metals, stones, and ideas, weaving foreign influences into their own culture with astonishing fluidity. This openness made them wealthy and innovative, but it also meant that when the tides turned literally and politically, their exposure was total. Disruption in one part of their trade network rippled across the whole system. In our globalized world, the parallels are obvious. We benefit from unprecedented connectivity, but that same connectivity ensures that a crisis in one place can become a crisis everywhere. The Minoans remind us that openness is a strength only if it's balanced with resilience. Another subtler lesson lies in the importance of cultural memory. The Minoans had no recorded history that we can read. Their own voice is locked away. In the undeciphered linear A, we reconstruct their story from archaeology and the myths of other peoples, myths that sometimes distort as much as they reveal. When they disappeared as a distinct culture, so did their ability to shape how they were remembered. This is why they survive in popular imagination as half-historical, half-mythical figures, sometimes noble and enlightened, sometimes decadent and doomed. For us, the warning is this: if you lose control of your own narrative, others will write it for you, and those narratives can last far longer than the events themselves. The Minoans also show us how resilience is not just about rebuilding, but about adapting. After the Thera eruption, they did rebuild ports, fleets, trade routes, but they did not adapt their political or military strategy to the new reality. They tried to restore the old order rather than creating a new one that acknowledged their changed circumstances. This may have been their fatal error. Resilience is not simply persistence. It's the ability to alter course when the world no longer matches your assumptions. The difference between survival and collapse is often the speed and depth of that adaptation. Finally, there's the moral lesson embedded in their Atlantis shadow. Plato's retelling turned their downfall into a warning against hubris. While the archaeological record doesn't support the idea that the Minoans were arrogant or morally corrupt, the myth endures because it speaks to a universal truth. Power invites scrutiny and downfall invites explanation. People prefer a moral reason for disaster. They brought it on themselves, to the scarier reality that sometimes catastrophe is simply the result of chance, nature, or forces beyond anyone's control. Understanding this helps us see our own vulnerability more clearly, without the comforting illusion that virtue alone can keep disaster at bay. The Minoans are, in the end, a mirror. They reflect our best aspirations, creativity, openness, cultural sophistication, and our most dangerous blind spots, overconfidence, reliance on fragile systems, underestimation of change. To study them is to study ourselves, but with the safety of a few thousand years' distance. That safety, however, is an illusion if we fail to take the lessons seriously. Every advanced civilization inherits both the achievements and the vulnerabilities of the ones before it. The Minoans inherited maritime skill and fertile land. We have inherited technologies that can move information, goods, and people across the planet in hours. Their sea was the Aegean. Ours is a web of digital and logistical networks that bind the globe. And just like the Minoans, we tell ourselves that these systems will hold, because they always have. But the Minoans show us how quickly always can collapse into once. Consider climate change. The Minoans lived in an environment they believed they understood: the seasonal winds, the rhythms of planting and harvest, the temper of the sea. Thera shattered that understanding in an instant. Our own environmental shifts are slower, but no less destabilizing. Rising seas threaten modern coastal cities just as surely as they drowned Minoan harbors. Shifting weather patterns can disrupt global food production as easily as volcanic ash may have choked Cretan fields. The question is not whether we will face disruptions we already are, but whether we will adapt faster than the Minoans did. Then there is geopolitical fragility. The Minoans' openness made them wealthy, but it also made them dependent on the stability of others. When Mycenaean ambitions rose, the Minoans' advantage became a liability. Our own global networks operate on the same principle of mutual benefit until they don't. Supply chains, alliances, trade agreements. These are only as secure as the political will that sustains them. History does not need to repeat exactly for its warnings to be valid. The pattern is enough. The Minoans also force us to think about cultural survival in an age of crisis. Their art, architecture, and rituals were vibrant expressions of identity, yet all of it could be and was absorbed into another culture's framework. The Mycenaeans did not obliterate Minoan culture. They repurposed it, rebranding its symbols to suit their own narratives. This is not just an ancient phenomenon. In the modern world, cultures can be reshaped or overwritten by political dominance, economic pressure, or even by the sheer force of global media. The Minoan fate shows that survival is not just about holding territory. It's about holding the power to define yourself in the eyes of the world. And perhaps the most haunting lesson is about how memory distorts. The Minoans, as we know them, are partly real and partly a reflection of what others from Mycenaean scribes to Plato to Arthur Evans, have wanted them to be. In that way, their story has been curated by those who came after, not by the Minoans themselves. We should take that as a warning about our own legacies. The story that will be told about us centuries from now will not be written by us. It will be shaped by survivors, interpreters, and the needs of their own time. Just as we reframe the Minoans, they will reframe us. In the end, the Minoans leave us with a paradox. They lived in a world that was at once small and vast, small enough that the eruption of a single island could destabilize their entire civilization, vast enough that their ships could bring them goods and ideas from thousands of miles away. We live in a similar paradox, only magnified. The same interconnectedness that makes us powerful also makes us fragile. The same openness that enriches us also exposes us. The same faith in the stability of our systems can blind us to the very forces that could undo them. So what, then, is the real lesson? It is not that all civilizations are doomed, or that openness is folly, or that peace is naive. It is that the strength of a society lies not in the permanence of its structures, but in the adaptability of its people. The Minoans rebuilt after disaster, but they rebuilt in the image of the past, not the needs of the future. That is a mistake we cannot afford to make. The ruins of Knossos do not whisper warnings in words. They whisper them in absence. In the empty courts where once processions moved, in the collapsed halls where merchants tallied goods, in the silent storerooms where grain once filled massive jars, they whisper that no system is eternal, no advantage unassailable, no civilization immune to change. But they also whisper that beauty, creativity, and human ingenuity can endure in ways that power cannot. 3,000 years after their fall, the Minoans still speak to us, not in their own language, but in the language of what they left behind. And so we return to the idea of a civilization that lived twice. The Minoans lived their first life in the Bronze Age sun, their sails catching the wind as they crossed the Aegean, their cities alive with color and ceremony. Their second life is now in our imagination, in the ways we study them, argue about them, and reshape their story to fit our own questions. That second life is fragile, too. It will change with each generation, fading in some places, brightening in others. But for now, the labyrinth still stands in the mind, and the thread still runs through it, a line from their world to ours, taut and unbroken if we care enough to hold it. We may never decipher linear, we may never know exactly how they worshipped, governed, or saw themselves. But perhaps that's part of the lesson, too, that mystery is not failure, but endurance. The Minoans cannot tell us in their own words what to learn from them, so we must decide for ourselves. And if we decide well, perhaps we can avoid the fate of those who trusted the sea too much, believing it would always be a friend. The Minoans lived twice. First in the sunlit courtyards of their palaces, in the rhythm of ships coming and going from their harbors, in the laughter of festivals, and the quiet precision of craftsmen shaping beauty from stone and clay. And then again in the centuries after their fall, as a memory refracted through myth, half-truth, and rediscovery. Whether Plato's Atlantis was ever real matters less than the truth we can see, that a people can leave a legacy bright enough to shine through 3,000 years of darkness. Their walls have crumbled, their language is still locked away in undeciphered symbols, yet their spirit endures in the art, the stories, and the questions they left behind. And maybe, just maybe, they still have secrets left to tell.